Good afternoon, folks. Well, we're going to talk about this one in particular thing. We all know about the top four. Number one, Georgia versus number four, Ohio State. Number three, number two, Michigan versus number three, TCU. Now, let's talk about the history of these teams that take on each other. First, TCU versus Michigan. These two have never met. First time ever in their history have these two ever met. So, anything's possible between them two. Now, Ohio State versus Georgia. Last time the two met was in 93. We'll talk about bowl games. And it was in a bowl game. We'll talk about that bowl game later on. So, another time coming. Ohio State lost 21-14 to Georgia. So, Georgia, that's the only time the two have ever met. So, this is the second time these two have met. And Georgia leads the series at currently 1-0. Now, that team up north who has played Georgia, the first time the two met was in 1957, a long time ago, long before I was born. It was a 26-0 win for that team up north. Big blast by them. And then in 1965, Georgia had a rematch with them and beat them 15-7. And then in the most recent year, Georgia comes away with another win, 35-11. Georgia holds the series 2-1. Now Georgia versus TCU. First time in 1942 was the first meeting. 40-26 goes to Georgia. Then several years later, 1980, Georgia trounces TCU 34-3. And then 1988, Georgia hands it to TCU again, 34-10. Then 2016, recently, in another bowl game, Georgia beats TCU 31-23. Now, granted, a lot of things have to happen. That team up north has to beat TCU for the first time, which would make them 0-1, or TCU has to beat them to make them 1-0 against them. Now, for them to have a rematch with either Georgia or Ohio State. But Ohio State has a lot to come aware with. Now, Ohio State recently is like 3-1-2. 3-1-1 with TCU. I don't have any stats on them, but I just know that because I study a lot about Ohio State, but I wasn't smart enough to write down the final scores. So, I'm sorry for that part. Now, if we look at how all these other games are, we're going to compare stats from this year to that year. Okay? Now, 2020. Now we're going to look at stats from this year's defense to last year's. We're going to look at not last year's, but we're going to look at stats this year. Then we're going to look at bowl games that every team has had. First, we'll start with that team up north. When they beat Colorado State, they won 51-7, 219 yards to 440. Now, the first number, let me start again. The first number is the yards the defense is allowed. The second number is how many yards the offense put up. Now, Hawaii. They beat Hawaii 56-10. Astounding number there. 253 yards to 588 yards. Now, and then that team up north beats Connecticut 59-0, a shutout win. 110 total yards to 465 yards. Then Maryland, that team up north beats Maryland 34-27, very close contest, I gotta say, a much more improved Maryland team. 397 yards allowed to 463. Very good game. Can't say that it was a weak team. And then they played Iowa beat Iowa 27-14. Very good game. Then they stomped Indiana 31-10, 222 yards allowed to 469. Then Penn State, a big, enormous victory, 41-17, 268 yards allowed to 563 yards. Then came Michigan State, 29-7, 252 yards to 443 yards. Then Rutgers, an overwhelming victory, 52-17, 180 yards to 433 yards. Then Nebraska, 34-3, 146 yards to 412 yards. And then Illinois, the close nail-biter, 326 yards to 376 yards. Then came Ohio State. Such an embarrassing win, such a disappointing performance by Ohio State, an embarrassing loss by Ohio State. That team up north, 45, Ohio State 23. 492 yards to 530 yards. Now, Purdue, on the other hand, such an embarrassing performance by the defense of that team up north. 456 yards to 386 yards. The only team to outdo their defense, to put more yards up than their offense. Now, let's look at other teams such as TCU. TCU, who played Colorado, 348 yards to 413 after a 38-13 win. Then Tarleton State, a nobody team, they destroy 59-17, 295 yards to 630 yards. Now TCU stomps SMU. Well, close game. I can't say it stomps, excuse me. 42-34. It was a 476 yards to 487 yards. But then TCU embarrasses Oklahoma. Quite embarrassing, I gotta say. 355 yards to 668. And then they take on Kansas. Very close competition on this one. Quite embarrassing to allow that many yards. I mean, Kansas was a good team this year. I gotta say, hats off to Kansas. They played a very good season this year. 38-31, TCU wins it. About 540 yards to 452. Good game by them. Then Oklahoma State, double overtime. 43-40. 386 yards to 510 yards. Good game. Then Kansas State. TCU wins 38-28. 390 yards allowed to 495 yards. Then West Virginia. 41-31. Then 430 yards allowed to 494 yards. Then TCU takes care of business with Texas Tech. 352 yards to 429 yards. Then TCU takes care of business, gets right past Texas with only a touchdown, winning 17-10. 199 yards to 283 yards. Then TCU and Baylor. A field goal at the last second. 29-28. Only a 1-point winner. 501 total yards to 442. Such a dismantling disappointment on defense. But then TCU, who gets past who destroys Iowa State, 377 yards to 330 yards. Kind of, I don't understand how that even works there, considering you allow the defense so many more yards, but yet you dismantle the offense, a disgruntled offense. I don't understand that. And then the most embarrassing moment. I don't know what happened here. A rematch with Kansas State in the Big 12 championship. TCU almost had it. All they had to do was kick a field goal And then Kansas State kicked a field goal and won it in overtime. 31-28. Kansas State defeats TCU. 404 yards to 469 yards. It was that simple. All TCU had to do was kick a field goal and force a second overtime. It was that simple. 39. It would have been 31-31. Double overtime then. But they chose to go for a second. They chose to go for it on fourth down for the end zone. And Kansas State's defense stepped up and stopped them. Hats off to Kansas State. They played a very good job. And now we look at Georgia. I mean, Georgia is a pretty good, and that team up north deserved that second spot. And TCU, I'm kind of questioning that, but I mean, oh well. Maybe they deserve the fourth, maybe they deserve the third. I don't know. I mean, that's totally up to the committee's decision. But let's see how Georgia favored in their total defense and everything. Georgia overwhelmingly defeated Oregon, 49-3. Looked like they pretty much manhandled them. 313 yards to 571 yards. Pretty good game. And then they dismantled Samford, 33-0. 128 yards to 479 yards. Good game. Then they dismantle South Carolina, 48-7. That'd be 306 yards to 547 yards. But then came the game with Kent State. 500 with a 39-22 victory over Kent State. The final score was a disappointing final score, I must say. 281 yards allowed to 529 yards, but after that 48-7 win over South Carolina, that was 306 yards allowed to 547. If I didn't mention it already, excuse me. Then Missouri, a 26-22 win, 294 yards to 481 yards. Now, on to Auburn. A 42-10 smashing of a disgruntled Auburn team. 258 yards allowed to 500 yards, even. Never seen that happen before. And then Vanderbilt. 55-0 stomping and blanking of Vanderbilt. 150 yards to 579 yards. And then came the game with Florida. Kind of reminds me of the Ohio State versus Oregon game, the national championship game. Very interesting. It's the same score, 42-20, except 371 yards to 555 yards. Pretty much a non-stop game. And then came the game with Tennessee. Georgia 27, Tennessee 13. 289 yards to 387 yards. And then Georgia 45, Mississippi State 19. 308 yards to 468 yards. Pretty impressive game. And then Georgia 16, Kentucky 6. 295 yards to 363 yards. And then Georgia beats out Georgia Tech 37-14. With 255 yards to 407 yards. Now comes the interesting game, the SEC Championship. Georgia pretty much handles LSU 50-30. But, however, LSU outgains them 549 yards to 529 yards. Not many yards difference, but a significant amount of yards difference there. Now, we look at Ohio State and see the difference in this game. Ohio State beats Notre Dame 21-10 with 253 yards to 395 yards. Arkansas, then they manhandled Arkansas State for 45-12, 276 yards to 538. Then they stomped Toledo 77-21, 307 yards to 763 yards. Then they beat out Wisconsin 52-21. A disgruntled Wisconsin team, I must say. 296 yards to 539 yards. Then they stomped Rutgers 49-10 with 187 yards to 413. Then Ohio State beats out Michigan State 49-20, 202 yards to 614 yards. Then they destroy Iowa 54-10, 159 yards to 360 yards. Then they just get past Penn State on a very disappointing performance. 44-31, turnovers was what the key in that game was. 482 yards to 452 yards allowed. I mean, that was pretty sad. And then they barely get past Northwestern, winning 21-7. And then 285 yards allowed to 283. And then they played Indiana, winning 56-14. 269 yards allowed to 662. Then they played Maryland, winning 43-30. Again, turnovers was the key in that game. And 402 yards allowed to 401 yards. Then that team up north, a flat, despicable performance. 530 yards to 492. Now, with these teams comes a difference. What do these teams have in common? You ask yourself, what did these teams do differently that could have been different? Well, you ask yourself the numbers. All these numbers I read to you tell you one thing. I'll read the bowl numbers later, and you tell me the difference. But right now, the bowl numbers say a lot. The bowl numbers will tell you, hey, those, not the bowl numbers, but these numbers here say a lot. I mean, this could be the revenge of the underdogs. I mean, this could be Ohio State's year, just like it was in 2014. Everybody underestimated Ohio State. I mean, a lot can happen here. This could be an Ohio State versus that team up north again, or this could be an Ohio State versus TCU. I mean, I've seen where Ohio State, where when you beat an Ohio State team close to the end of the year, they get really furious and they come out with a vengeance. I've seen that happen. And trust me, I've seen disgruntled teams come out more angrier than when they were after that game. And trust me, this has been one of those kind of seasons where you struggle on defense and then you have a total letdown in the second half. Now, on the other hand, that team up north, they've had literally every game they've struggled in the first half, and in the second half they come out with a swing and literally turn the game around in their favor. I mean, Purdue, on the other hand, that was an incredible game by Purdue. I mean, they pretty much stopped that team up north in the first half, but somehow they managed to fall flat on the second half, but only managed to kick field goals. That team up north's defense did pretty good, I gotta say. But if you take away all those field goals, Purdue wins the game. Hands down. But on the other hand, Purdue had them in their grasp. They literally had them in the grasp, but failed to capitalize on a lot of things. On the other hand, I gotta say, it was a good game by both teams. But TCU, on the other hand, is kind of inconsistent, so you can't really say there's a really easy winner in that game. So that game more looks like a toss-up. Now, Georgia, on the other hand, they seem to be consistent throughout the whole entire game. I mean, then again, Ohio State, they've been kind of consistent all year till they played, till later on in the season, they kind of fell backwards, but you can't really say it was a fall flat on the season, but I kind of say, like, I don't know. I mean, this is one of those games where you gotta kind of ask yourself, who do you think has the upper hand? I mean, Alabama had the upper hand in that game in 2015 Sugar Bowl. They were ahead 20. They were ahead 7-0, 2 field goals. Then it became a 20. Then it came a 7-6, and then Alabama took a 21-6. Looked like they were gonna walk away with it. Then lo and behold, Ohio State came back, trailed only 21-20 at half, and then Ohio State kind of took command of the game. Ohio State went for 2, made it 28 to, I think it was 28-7 that they went for 2. Maybe it was the second touchdown. I can't remember. It's been so long ago since I watched that game. But they ended up winning 42-35. But hats off to Ohio State in that game. They played like they wanted to win. After a disgruntled part season, they came back and actually proved that they wanted to win the game. That's how you win games, because they never quit. That was when JT Barrett was still quarterback, and they proved that when they laid the law down on Wisconsin, 59-0. I mean, nobody expected that. I didn't even see that coming. I figured it'd be like a 27-24 win. I wasn't expecting to be that close. But 59-0, that's saying something. Now, later on today, I'll be talking about the bowl games, and we'll say, and you tell me what you think of these bowl games. Now, hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. With that being said, I'm out of here. Peace.